Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of the Middle East Research and Information Project, and I am really happy to welcome everybody here today to the third event in our Syria at the Crossroads series that we are co-producing with our comrades in arms at Spectre Journal. Today, we are going to be talking primarily about the recent crisis in Suweida. We're going to be unpacking the sectarian dynamics and how they've changed since the fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime last December. We're going to be joined by three amazing scholars, activists, and journalists today to discuss all of that. Before we get started, if you're coming to us for the first time in this series, I do encourage you all to go back to the two earlier conversations we've had. You can find those on MERIP's YouTube page. We've also released the audio of it onto our new podcast feed. I'll post links to all of that in the chat before too long. And I also want to really sincerely thank my comrade Shireen Akram-Boshar, who is going to be our co-host for the discussion today. She's from Spectre's editorial board, as well as Ashley Smith, who's doing a lot of work in the background for us today, also from Spectre. So joining us today are Sara Ajlyakin, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the Al-Jumhuriyah Collective, Sana Mustafa, who is a Syrian activist, and Yasser Munif, a scholar and professor at Emerson College and author of The Syrian Revolution Between the Politics of Life and the Geopolitics of Death. And I want to just really jump in right away with a somewhat general question. Each of you, Sara, Sana, and Yasser, have been in Syria, for stretches of time over the last 8 months or so, and that's been a really critical part of the observations we've shared over the course of this series. I just want to ask you, what have you seen? What has been your understanding of what's happening on the ground? And since you've been back, none of you are in Syria at the moment. What do you think has changed? So I might start with Sara, and we'll go from there. Okay.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. I don't know where to start, really. First of all, I just want to say it's a very hard time to speak as Syrians. I mean, we have maybe very naively never thought that we would live to write about, to think about, to process yet another massive massacre. And we've seen already two. And none of us are from Suweida here, unfortunately, today, but it's very, very hard time to think and write and speak of and about Syria. So just starting with that, like on a personal note, I think that we Syrians are, I mean, I speak for myself at least, are confronting very violently and in real time what many of us have long known but struggled to admit, is that the revolutionary movement was defeated a very long time ago. It was crushed by massacres, by prisons, by mass impoverishment, complete and systematic disenfranchisement of entire people. And from this defeat, Syrian society in its entirety emerged and is still emerging completely brutalized, depoliticized, and fragmented, and its social fabric entirely torn apart. And we have a very vast lumpenized class, and I speak this not in a derogatory way, but in its actual Marxist orthodox sense. Dispossessed, criminalized, ghettoized, and stripped of any foothold in productive labor. And I think this became both a symptom and an actual instrument of Syria's destruction. And then come December last year, and the regime collapsed, and not by, as the official narrative goes, or as a consequence and result of revolutionary forces, but very clearly because of shifts in the geopolitical context of the country, and certain decisions were taken. And I say this not like to be like sort of a boome, like we say in Arabic, or an owl, or pessimistic, but de facto we have the Quinta Columna, the fifth column, took over power in Syria. And this, and they are inheriting the spoils of an extremely broken and shattered society. And this is, of course, not without precedent in history, but this has consequences. And I say this as an introduction today on the question of sectarianism and the question of what kind of what we ask ourselves every day is, what are the consequences of this brutal defeat of the revolution years ago on the political consciousness of the Syrian population, its different classes, its ability to mobilize? And I think this is what we're seeing and confronting today, just as a general note.
Thanks, Sara. Sana, I'll turn to you next.
Thanks, Sara. Truly, and I mean, thanks everyone for having us. And definitely, I think Sara paved the way for this discussion for all these acknowledgement and of the reality. And I think December 8th, you know, no, I hope not many of us were not naive into what led to this moment. And I think despite our, I would say personally, despite all the things that Sara mentioned and all the realizations, there was a little like hope that really tried to like surface regardless of all these realities. And I think we really, personally, I really hoped things will be different, knowing the background of the new transitional government and what led to the December 8th. So there, I can't lie, there was a moment of hope that I had when December 8th happened and I got to Syria on December 12th. And I think, you know, the moment I touched the ground and start, as many of you know, my father has been forcibly disappeared on the hands of the Assad regime since July 2nd, 2013. And so when I got to Syria for the first time after 12 years of his disappearance, I got there to search for him. And I think the moment I started that journey on December 13, 2024, the reality starts really hitting immediately and realizing that actually not much has changed. And this moment is already collapsing for me about the hope for something different. And we've seen that if we want to talk about the transitional justice and the collection of evidence and any effort or any initiative the new government has taken towards these important files, important to not just to the Syrian revolution and to the premise of it and the foundation of it, but also actually important to Syrians, even if they did not participate in the revolution, even if they were apolitical. There is not a single Syrian family that has not experienced something around disappearance, detention, kidnapping, and killings of a family member. And so that sense of justice and truth that's needed, I have yet to see any real initiative by any actors on the ground from the Syrian government, an initiative that's actually not biased, an initiative that's actually not performative and symbolic. And so I'm afraid, and the reality is this is really one of the major reasons that we are continuing to see the events, or that's why the events that folded or unfolded are happening. And I think we all were cautious about how December 8th happened without blood. And it was, you know, that was kind of the theme. It was like, oh my God, like December 8th happened without blood. And it just was delayed blood. It happened on March 8th and with the massacre, the coastal massacre, and then obviously now with the Suweida, and it was happening every day through these individual violations. And again, I think one disclaimer is that to say, I really was personally trying to give this a chance. Like, despite all my political analysis and understandings of the new officials and the realities and the geopolitics, I really wanted to be like, well, it needs time. Let's give it a chance. But they kept pushing us to face it in a way that, you know, you find ourselves having this conversation today, being like, well, it's been 8 months, and no, it's not just not given a chance. Like it's been enough time that they did something completely the opposite of what should have been done. And one last thing about that is that the negligence and coverage of evidence and destroying of evidence of existing war crimes by the Assad regime. Also, that's something that's it's my as a family of the disappeared, it's my biggest disappointment. And probably many of you know that, including, you know, we were one of the lucky ones to find a writing of my dad on one of the walls of a cell, yet they painted over it. It's beyond grief, it's beyond frustration, it's beyond anger. And then all of that comes with the massacres of our other Syrian fellows in the coast and Suweida. And so I'm sorry, I'm not optimistic at all, but this is where we are at the moment.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Sana. And we've been following the story of your search for your father, and along with Wafa, who joined us in the first of these conversations. And yeah, optimism maybe is not going to be on the table for this discussion for quite a while. Yasser, I'll turn to you. What have you seen in Syria since you've been there and since you've been back?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I share many of the things that Sara and Sana said. I've been 3 times to Syria in the past 8 months. First in January, and the last time I just came back a few days ago from Syria. And in the beginning, I was very skeptical of the Jabhat al-Nusra or HTS for obvious reason. For anyone who was following the Syrian revolution and know their trajectory and what they were up to and what they did during the revolution, I think could clearly see where and what they would do after the fall of the regime. But I was reluctant to criticize HTS in the first month and a half. But very clearly, I mean, since the massacres of March and then ongoing massacres of Alawite, it didn't stop in March, has been ongoing to this day. And more recently in Suweida, in addition to the bombing of the church and the attacks on the Kurdish region and so on, I became much more skeptical. I want to go back briefly to, I think, the potential of the Syrian revolution. I think the Syrian revolution was very radical. It was producing radical politics that was frightening the entire region. The Syrian revolution produced revolutionary committees and autonomous region, and people were producing all sorts of very important politics, autonomous politics in many regions, including the participation of women and urban and rural areas, experimenting with very creative form of politics. And I think the fall of the regime is a combination of the agreement that that Sara and Sana mentioned, but it was also a hollowed state. It was a narco state living on looting, and was very weakened by December 2024. And so it was a matter of time before it fell. Obviously, the regional power, including Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the Emirates and beyond and Israel, didn't want a radical outcome of that revolution, and therefore they were interested in handing over the state, the nation, to the most despised group, I think, in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, and the alliance and the different groups that were allied with them, for a simple reason. I mean, that has been the strategy of the US throughout and European powers throughout. If we look back in the 1950s, whether in Egypt or in Syria, they were looking for a powerful and bloody general who was despised and didn't have any social base, because you can easily get rid of him whenever you needed to. And they are easy to bargain with, because you're protecting them. You are, as a foreign power, whether in the Gulf or the US or Israel, they depend on you for keeping their power. So this is what we have. This is the alliance that we have. It's a militia. They're using the state as a facade, but behind that, they're simply a militia and function as a militia, and they're looting and distributing the loot among the different segment of those militias. So it's a grim picture right now, not very helpful, but who knows? I mean, what is next for Syria?
Yeah, thank you for that, Yasser. And you know, it's been part of our theme of this series of conversations to help people understand both the specific internal Syrian dynamics of the transitional regime, but also to help people understand the ways in which it really is a regional crisis, right, and a geopolitical crisis as well. And I want to make sure that we get into that in the context of talking about Suweida, sectarianism, and so forth. So I think you know, this would be a good time to kind of really just turn to the crisis in Suweida for folks who, you know, I think most people who are with us have heard something about this. Maybe they haven't gotten so far into the details or the dynamics, but this region, a city in Syria, has been in a state of crisis for over a month now. About a month ago, a Druze merchant was kidnapped and tortured by Bedouin armed groups, and this sparked a series of retaliatory kidnappings and attacks that then spiraled into a more open armed conflict, that included the forces from the transitional government coming to the aid of the Bedouin groups to repress the Druze, and also, of course, Israel's intervention into the crisis, including bombings in and around Suweida as well as in Damascus. The count that I most recently saw, there was over 1,000 dead, 100,000 internally displaced. I want to ask you, could you talk to us about the situation in Suweida? What does it say about the current moment for Syria, for you specifically? And how has the transitional government, sectarian groups, and Israel all worked together to ignite this situation? Sara, can I turn it back to you? Start us off there. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I cannot very much speak about the situation inside Suweida. I'm not there, but I do know that it's absolutely disastrous. But I do have to say that it would be, and this is a problem with Syria today, it's like it would be very difficult, only if you're assuming that we really do have a Syrian army that is consolidated and acts as an army with centralized hierarchical power, would you be surprised at what happened in Suweida? We don't. I mean, it's just nomenclatura, right? We are still dealing with a state that's with an army, and not only just the general security forces, that is very much like sort of a patchwork of sometimes organized militias like HTS, but also, and more broadly, young men who have been recruited over the past couple of months and have underwent little to no training, military training and otherwise, other than a few words from a random sheikh here or there. And all of those are being, have been basically, the violence that we saw in Suweida is one that we have been seeing over Syria over the past 10 years. I think you would only be shocked at what happened if you presume that we are really working with an actual consolidated Syrian state. We're not. We're seeing militias, and this also applies to certain militias in Suweida as well, engaged in sectarian strife. And this has been the case in Syria over the past 10 years, and nothing has changed with the transitional government trying to gain power in Syria. It still has absolutely no monopoly over violence all over the country. And at the same time, and this is something that I think what's the most worrying part about Suweida that perhaps didn't apply as much on the coast is specifically Suweida's role over the past years in the revolutionary movement itself. And this to me was, I think, the most disappointing and shocking part when you speak about sort of the social base or the presumed social base of the current transitional government. And I know, and I always remind myself that like too many of us are mistaking the noise of Facebook for the pulse of the streets. And this is something that we have to keep reminding ourselves, right? But nonetheless, all of us felt that what happened in Suweida gained widespread support amongst in Syrian, especially the regime's Sunni base. And I think this was the most shocking element of everything.
Thanks. Sana, I'll just turn to you going around the table. Go ahead.
Yeah, same. At first, I haven't been to Suweida recently, and obviously I'm not there. And I think I want to acknowledge that we don't have presence here from someone from Suweida, and I know we tried, Shireen, but people are exhausted from there, from speaking to media, exhausted from worrying about their families, from living the conditions. But I happened to be yesterday on a conversation with a few of women from Suweida who are living in Suweida, and we're sharing their horrific experiences in the last month, really witnessing the massacre of their loved ones, the kidnapping of their kids, the fear for their daughters, their elderlies. And I mean, the story is really super familiar, unfortunately. And as Sara mentioned, the stories similar to the stories that many parts of Syria have experienced in the last 15 years. And the coast has experienced recently and continues to experience, by the way. And I think that's the other thing, like the issues in the coast have not really ended. The mass killing has ended. And maybe the massacre in the way that it's systematic has stopped for the moment, but the individual systematic violations have not stopped. And so, and same in Suweida. And I think it's a debate if Suweida under siege or not. And from people there, it's not a debate. Suweida is under siege. If it's a debate about the killing, so it's not a debate. People have been killed and systematically. I think, as Sara mentioned, is that obviously there are many groups affiliated with the government and maybe not affiliated with the government that have led to this situation, and it's hard to blame some specific actor. And I would say the bottom line with the Syrian government, the new government, is that it really, unfortunately, we Syrians now again divided. I feel divided in my communities with people that we revolted in 2011. Now we have different, stands, and we feel like some want to give bigger chance to the new government. Some don't want to even see the new mistakes. And this is like a grief, another grief that we are going through as Syrians with people that we shared a lot with in the last 12 years. But there's a lot of, narrative out there that the government is completely innocent of this massacre. And I think the bottom line is that as you have assigned yourself as a government for Syria, then you are responsible, you are accountable, and you are to be held accountable to control the situation. And I think one nuance to Suweida that also, besides the nuance that Sara mentioned in comparison to the cost around the role of Suweida in the revolution, and actually the revolution in the protests during the Assad regime in the last recent years, they continue to do that, the closeness to Israel, right? And the use of that narrative. And it's so unfortunate. I think in the last few days, it felt a bit of a deja vu of the 2011 when the current Syrian government says that Israel is, the reason behind what happened is Suweida. And, it's like when US gave us $25 to go and protest the Assad regime. And it's just constantly, linking people's revolutions and people's struggle and movements into Western Asians has been the classic way to undermine and to fall for it again. I mean, that's, I guess, what's really sad is that, yes, of course, Israel used the situation and is utilizing and leveraging the situation for their own agenda, but not to mistake that we are in Suweida. We have very specific circumstances in Syria with the different groups and sects that are leading, that have been internal mistakes. We can't appoint all our mistakes because of external interventions. And I think like one of the messages that maybe I will end with that was shared yesterday by the women of Suweida is for us to not move on and forget Suweida. And for us, and again, I think the independent investigation is very necessary. Simply and I think the current government has to understand fairly, we don't have trust in these existing mechanisms. Why should you assume that we should trust you? We've been there for 8 months. It really shouldn't be a point of opposition even. It should be like there should be an independent committee that's looking into that. And we've seen today Jamhuriya launched the report about the independent investigation about the coast as well. And so same, Suweida needs an independent investigation, and Suweida needs to be talked about, needs to be protected. And I think we need a very clear accountability measures that will also hold the government and their affiliated groups that committed these crimes. And I think my biggest fear is that with Suweida and the coast massacres, if real accountability measures are not taken, Syria, it's a pivotal point again, and we're headed towards lack of stability, and I think more bigger events of sectarian violence going forward.
Thank you, Sana. And I think we're going to return to this question in the context of transitional justice and economic reconstruction a bit later. And I want to say, the point you bring up about the kind of almost farcical assertions of Israel or the US being behind protests. And it's even more farcical now. One of the first I saw right after the events in Suweida, right wingers like Daniel Pipes in the United States saying Israel should intervene to stop a genocide. in Suweida. I mean, like this is the level of, you know, farce that we've reached with that kind of point. And turning to Yasser, I mean, almost pulling out of that, I mean, I would love for you to speak maybe a little bit more to the regional politics of Suweida. Like, how do we understand a bit more clearly the regional actors and the positions they've taken on massacres like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Sana and Sara mentioned a lot of facts about what's going on in Suweida. I will add that right now there are 1,600 people were killed, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. At least 166 are civilian, and possibly many more. 400, more than 400 extrajudicial execution by state security forces. And so it's a very grim situation. In addition, as you said, there are 100,000 people who were displaced. The humanitarian situation is very difficult. There is a siege that has been ongoing since July 13. And more recently, Israel, as you mentioned, wants to help and send humanitarian aid to Suweida, which is a farce, as you said, because Israel is obviously committing a genocide against the Palestinian and has not treated the Druze in Israel that well. I mean, Druze, people know that Druze serve in the army, are part of the IDF and so on, but they are also an oppressed minority in Israel. Their houses are often demolished. They don't have access to the water. They don't have the same rights as Jewish Israeli. They are often deprived of education and so on and so forth. But Israel want to project this image that that Druze are completely included and are part of the Israeli society, and that this is what the Druze of Syria should aspire for. But the situation of the Druze in Israel is much more, I think, difficult than one thing. In addition to the Druze, the Syrian Druze who live in the Golan Heights, who have refused citizenship, have refused to serve in the army, have been oppressed by the Israeli, have been displaced, and their houses have been demolished, and so on and so forth. So Israel is not a neutral, objective actor, as I think everyone agrees on this panel. What I would add to this as well is that the attacks and the violence against the Druze is not new. I mean, we can go back to 2015 when Druze villages were attacked in the Idlib area, and they were forced to convert to Sunni Islam. The Druze are obviously not Sunni. And even after that, there were some were killed. At least 20 to 30 were killed by Jabhat al-Nusra. So there is also that history. More recently, in March, I think, in April or May, the Germana region was attacked. It's a suburb of Damascus, inhabited by Druze, and the security forces attacked that region because they were not willing to allow the security forces to enter their region after what they saw happened in the coastal areas. So this is what the Druze are facing right now. A lot of skepticism against the Syrian regime. They are not willing to allow the security forces to enter Suweida because of what happened in different regions. And more recent reports show that the whole idea or the official narrative about a conflict between the Druze and the Bedouin is not true. The Syrian regime or the security forces and Jolani forces prepared the attacks on Suweida. So now there are reports showing that there were some Druze forces within Suweida that allowed the security forces to enter, and all that was planned ahead of time. So,
yeah, thank you, Yasser. I think that you did a great job helping us understand, exactly how these sectarian dynamics play out on the ground. And I think I mean, when we were thinking about the topics for this particular, episode, we really wanted to think about how to address sectarianism in a way that doesn't feed into, some really terrible old line historical, narratives about sectarianism, about Arabs, about Syria in particular. And I thought, we might also reflect a little bit on how Syrians resist sectarian narratives. How Syrians, when they have the opportunity, resist the kind of top-down structures that create these kinds of crises, from the bottom up, and recognize and understand the ways in which the sectarian narrative undermines popular movements in so many ways. So I might ask, Sara, to start us off here. I mean, can you talk about, again, like the role of Suweida in Syrians resisting this narrative of sectarianism and resisting these structures of sectarianism, that's being used to crush a progressive spirit? I mean, we're in a moment of pessimism precisely because of sectarian clashes. Like, unpack this dynamic for us a little bit more.
Okay, I mean, I have to say something. Sectarianism wasn't born yesterday in Syria, right? We have a regime that ruled, the governance structure of the Syrian regime was ruled de facto through sectarianism. So it's not just like we woke up suddenly and the regime fell and, oh, we discovered we're a society that is organized along sectarian lines, right? And I think this is just like a small personal or sort of reflective observation. I do think that it's one of the sort of saddest ironies of histories that in societies that most need revolutions, and where counter-revolution so brutally crushes, what remains for emancipatory politics? I mean, is emancipatory politics and progressive politics possible today in Syria, in a society so severely damaged and brutalized, and not by Jolani, but by the Assad regime and by the international communities, who was completely complicit in allowing such a barbaric situation to go on for at least 13 years. And this is something that always takes me back. I know this doesn't directly answer your question, but I do have to mention that. This always takes me back to the point where we're all sort of struggling with the debate that's right now, we're over it, of should there be some kind of military intervention in Syria to rid us of this barbarism, or should there not be? I do think that the fact that this went on for 13 years left the Syrian population so brutalized, all of them, those who lived in Idlib, those in Suweida, those in Damascus, everywhere, that I do not see how sectarianism wasn't born yesterday. How Syrians can organize along minimally progressive lines away from sectarianism. We're speaking about a population, and again, I go back to the idea of lumpenized, because in terms of what other consciousness come out from a situation so brutal? Class consciousness? What kind of class composition has resulted after 13 years of destruction? And even right now, we're speaking about a population that has already been completely is completely precarious, and we're seeing the new regime. I mean, promises of 400% of a raise of minimum wage, and then we see like sort of endless celebrations of signing of memorandums of understanding with I don't know what company and this shell company here and there of sort of a luxury compound in Homs and another luxury resort in Tartus, and an administrative city in Damascus, when we have literally one of the most brutal and severe housing crises in history. We have probably half of the Syrian population with nowhere else to come back to, and nowhere else, not just in terms of physical space and a roof above their head, but nowhere else symbolically or politically. Where are the millions of Syrians that have been dispossessed over the past 13 years? Where are they today? Where are they? I mean, and I'm saying this, it's important. I know I'm moving away from Suweida into a more general context, but I do think that it's impossible to speak about sectarianism in Syria today or of Suweida without emphasizing this point. Where are the victims of the Syrian regime today in politics? Are they in the transitional government's economic program? No, they are not. Are they in the transitional government's conciliatory approach with previous regime figures? No, they are not. Where are they? And this is something that is very distressing, because I do think that Syrians are exhausted morally and politically, and this worries me on a personal level as well, because where are we going to amass the strength and the resilience after 13 years of destruction to be in solidarity with one another as Syrians, away from sectarian and hate speech and mobilize. And this is, to me, the question that most concerns me about Suweida, about the coast, but about also people in Damascus. Because I know right now we tend to speak of the regime's, the current government's Sunni base, but this is also a misnomer, because every day this base of the regime is confronting brutally, face to face, no electricity, no water, no food, no infrastructure. And so until when will we assume that sort of people will be enchanted by a victorious chants of December 8th? I don't think this will last long. And I do think that this is the most important fault line of breaking with sectarianism.
Thank you, Sara. I'm actually going to hand things off to Shireen Akram-Boshar, my co-moderator, to pick it up and ask a follow-up here. Shireen, go ahead.
Thanks, James. Continuing on this thread, I wanted to sort of transition in the same discussion of sectarianism. So today there's, unfortunately, as Sana was alluding to, there's narratives that suggesting that Alawites are all represent the old regime, that the Druze are all in favor of Israel's intervention in Syria, and so on. So I was wondering if you all could talk about how Syrians have pushed back against sectarianism. For example, the role of Suweida, even after the revolution seemed to be crushed in I believe 2023, Suweida had its own revolt, basically against, or mini uprising against the regime, and how it's pushed back against sectarianism in recent years, and sort of that back and forth dynamic to show that sectarianism really is a political tool to try to get rid of sort of a revolutionary consciousness that could demand something more than a shara. Yasser and then Sana, does that sound good?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like really, you know, Sara nailed it, and like kind of talking about that question of sectarianism. And I think one of them, inherently in the Syrian society, obviously, like the Assad regime used sectarianism to govern Syria. And then we as Syrians spent decades in denial of the existence of sectarianism. And, you know, and I think it's, there is like some novelty around like, no, we're not sectarian, and no, I look at my neighbor and I yes, I know, like I come from an area that really diverse, and, you know, Masyaf, like Ismaili, Alawiya, Masihi, like everyone. And yes, I would like to believe that to an extent, we're not very aware of sectarianism, but now in retrospect, when I think of my childhood, no, we were aware, and we did refer to people in a certain way. And that, not, you know, just like, I think there's something about us acknowledging and accepting that it is also internalized within all of us. And yes, we are adults now, and through the revolution, many of us worked through really examining this and seeing the bias and where it comes from and naming it. But I think there's like something about accepting and acknowledging that, yes, Syrian society, as us, not even just as the government and the regime, have internalized sectarianism. And I think so. This is like my first point. My second point, obviously, because of that, there is a huge narrative now around victimhood, right? And this is where you place around now, like the Sunnis are the victims, and that's it. The Sunnis are the victims of the last 15 years. The Syrian people are the victims of the last 55 years. And even like every single Syrian is actually a victim of the system, of the revolution, of the falling of the revolution, of the proxy war, of the World War III that happened on the Syrian soil. Like we are all the victims of that. And obviously this new government co-opted the revolution. And I think this is really, I think, one of the biggest grieving points for many of us who were part of that genuine 2011 street revolution, is that our revolution is co-opted now. Like they use our slogans, they use our ethics and our values to really use it against us. And this co-optation is painful. And now we have a narrative of obviously victimhood. And I think this is one of the most dangerous narrative. And we see it, if we look outside of Syria on any, with the Israelis, the narrative of victimhood is dangerous because it could be used to commit so much crimes, and we're not learning and we're not looking at that. And we do not have a proper processes, or don't have a government who's looking into putting any proper processes towards accountability and justice and truth finding, so we can start moving a bit away from sectarianism. We're not going to move away from all things that happened and this internalized discipline of sectarianism and fear and oppression just by building nice compounds without and then like creating Syria and Syria. And that's the reality now, right? We have many Syrias, and within Syria we have the class issue that Sara mentioned is epidemic. And I go there with all my privilege, and I feel the burden of the daily life. Imagine, like someone who's like, don't have the global access to the income that I do with all my privilege. And so, and Sara mentioned, like, this is something that's going to explode. And I think there's attempts to be masked constantly by, I feel like if you look at the last 80 months, every day when there's something really tragic happening, there's like a big announcement. And this like constant masking of events. And I remember the day that they bombed the church, or the church, explosion happened. It was the day they announced the salary increase, the 200% salary increase. And the Syrian brain that struggled for the last 55 years, and especially those who stayed in Syria for the last 15 years, really struggled. Like, I understand also people exhaustion and desire for wanting to make this new government as the salvation, but they are not our salvation. And I think this is what we are struggling with. And yeah, we'll continue to live that mask. And I think unless we come together again as Syrians and we decide to do things differently, we are falling again into the divisions of pro and against. I already see it. I already feel it. And I think it's just this time it's going to be way faster in terms of the loss and way worse.
Yeah, I think what you brought up in terms of the narrative that only Sunnis suffered under the regime is important, and remembering the role Suweida played and other activists in Jable who were Alawite, who went on the side of the revolution. But maybe Yasser, you could speak more to that aspect.
Yeah, I think we should start by rejecting this Orientalist reading of sectarianism. I mean, if you look at leaders in the West, including Obama and the more intellectual, I'm not even talking about Trump, who think about that region in sectarian terms, meaning that this conflict between so-called Shia and Sunni is 1,400 years old. It started in 632 after the death of Muhammad, and has been ongoing. And in many ways, it's very similar to the jihadist, takfiri reading of sectarianism, that it's there, it's ahistorical. And instead, I think we should embrace and think about sectarianism as a social construct, as a historical concept that has a history and is oftentimes instrumentalized by different powers. So the sectarianism of the Syrian regime, the top-down kind of sectarianism, is very different from the sectarianism that is coming from the bottom. And I just want to go back to Suweida for a moment to think about how sectarianism, for example, has been deployed in Suweida back in the early 19th century, in 1837-38, when the Druze were opposing conscription to the Ottoman armies. They used sectarianism, and they identified as Druze as a way to protect their community and reject the young men to join the Ottoman army. So that's very different from the sectarianism imposed from the top down by the Syrian regime for 50 years in Syria. And at other times, the Druze in Suweida have been very open and very far from this very restricting kind of identity, Druze identity. So for example, if we think about the revolt of 1925-27, when Sultan Bashar al-Adrash began the Syrian revolt back then against the French, and then it became a Syrian revolt against the French in most part of Syria, including Damascus, Aleppo, and elsewhere. It also opened channels with the Palestinian and Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who supported al-Atrash by funding and military and sending men and so on. And when the revolution and the Palestinian revolt in 1936 and 39 began in Palestine, the Druze sent also men, weapon, and funding to the Palestinian. And so we can see here how, you know, this identity that is oftentimes thought as a historical and fixed and so on is not really so when we look at specific historical moments. If we look at the present, as you said, Shireen, the Druze have been using the Druze identity at some point to refuse, again, the conscription of the Druze men in the Assadist war machine, because they knew that they were sent to be massacred. At the same time, most of the Druze were opposed to the Assad regime. And back in 2023, they began a revolt against the Assad regime that became also popularized and spread all over Syria, in Aleppo and Idlib and elsewhere. So I think it's important to historicize sectarianism and think about it in different ways, from the bottom up and top down, as well as from within, you know, Syrian sectarianism being exported to the region, as well as the kind of sectarianism that is imported from the Gulf and elsewhere. So there are all these different ways, I think, to think about sectarianism that makes it much more dynamic and versatile than just this Orientalist perception of Orientalism as fixed and ahistorical and has always been part of us. It's instrumental and people will use it when needed, and bloody regime can also use it to stay in power. And that's what the Syrian regime did, and this is also what Jolani is doing right now.
Shireen, if I may respond to Yasser.
Yes, please. Yeah.
To understand and appreciate a lot sort of sort of a critical perspective of like sort of Orientalist approaches to sectarianism, but I do think as well that it is also something that is very homegrown and a serious problem. Yes, I mean, one thing is our critique of how the West views and looks at and the length through which they understand our societies, but another thing is that it is actual and a very serious, a very substantial and serious problem in Syria. And just to go back to Shireen's initial question about what counter narratives are coming out? What are the possibilities for counter narratives in Syria? And I also want to say this we're not inventing the wheels as Syrians. I mean, we saw this in post-fascist Spain, where the very exemplary victims of the Spanish Civil War, for example, the associations of the families of the tortured, the disappeared. Is there anything more in terms of, I mean, not to use the word, it's a horrible, but perfect in terms of revolutionary social base, other than the families of the tortured, the disappeared, the association of Sadnaya prison? No, they have pure revolutionary legitimacy. And they will not, and they are not silent. And by the way, the majority are Sunni. We have to admit that. And so I'm also very careful about sort of the sort of demonization of the Sunni class in Syria today that we are seeing as well. Sort of the barbarians, the jihadis, the Salafis. And we are also seeing that, on the other hand, and specifically from left-wing or leftist organizations internationally, the demonization of the Sunnis on one hand, and also the overglorification of other minority groups, and not minority groups per se, but their reactionary representatives, such as the SDF forces in the north, and such as al-Hijri in Suweida. And this is the danger of sectarianism. The danger of sectarianism is even when we want to enact progressive politics, we turn to the sort of the minoritarian sort of question where presumably anything that is counter Sunni is progressive, and that's not the case in Syria. And this is the danger also of the current conjuncture. How can we, what is the possibility of progressive politics that does not demonize an entire segment of society, but also does not elevate other reactionary forces and قوات الأمر الواقع, like status, like sort of de facto powers that have also had very repressive role in the past 13 years and still do, by the way. How do we, what kind of balance can we establish here? And I think this is also an important question to say. And I do think that families, associations of the families of the disappeared, and we have Sana with us here, are literally the kernel of, and the most important kernel of progressive politics in Syria today. And the question is, how can their very legitimate cause be not a burden on their shoulder only, and be expanded to encompass every single Syrian that is very concerned about the democratic future of Syria? How can it encompass those who are without homes, the refugees, those who are without food? This is it. And they are Sunni. The majority of them are Sunni, and this is important to reconcile with as well.
Yeah, I appreciate the back and forth, and you both make some really important points. I also think that it's important to recognize how quickly consciousness changes in moments that are revolutionary or counter-revolutionary, and unfortunately, it seems like we're in a moment where, like you said, Sara, at the beginning, the people have emerged devastated and depoliticized. So the consciousness that was so progressive and inclusive in the beginning of the revolution is not what we're seeing at the current moment, but that doesn't mean that it can't reemerge. If it's okay with you, maybe I'll shift gears a little bit. I mean, not completely, but throughout this webinar series, we've discussed obviously the issue of transitional justice, as you were referring to, Sara, and the centrality of it, and the necessity of it for Syria today. So over the past couple of months, the transitional government has, thanks largely to the demonstrations and protests, I would say, the transitional government has put together fact-finding committees and other initial attempts to put forward something about transitional justice, but I think these have still largely exonerated the transitional government of responsibility. And the transitional government seems to be unable to pursue it legitimately pursue transitional justice because of its own implication in these crimes. So could you talk about the dangers of this continued lack of accountability and justice, and what efforts are still underway, that you were kind of alluding to, Sara? And I guess I'm also reminded of the fact that protesters in Damascus, immediately after the violence in Suweida started, there were continued protests. I know Wafa was there, but then there started to be more repression against people who were speaking out against the new government. Yeah, maybe Sana, do you want to go first?
I mean, I'm trying to think of where to start to respond to your question. I mean, again, I think the lack of proper, meaningful processes, we're seeing the outcome right now, and it's inevitable. And so, I mean, it's just I think it's a very simple answer. Obviously, many of these processes that have been put together by the new government, actually they're tokenistic and symbolic mainly. And and I know even around the committee about the missing persons, and I know from the internal intel, even within these, there are people who we respect and amazing, but if you also notice, most of there is they would not take people who have been critical of the new government and who would really not be held back from speaking up. And I think this is something we're experiencing firsthand, my sister and I, and others will not, and we have no role. And we will have no role in space. And I think that speaks into the oppression and repression that you mentioned around, after the protest that happened in Damascus in solidarity with Suweida. And yes, everyone is fearing for their lives now. And I think what's unique about this new fear that we are experiencing as activists versus the fear we experienced during the Assad regime is that during the Assad regime era, it was really kind of known. You will be kidnapped, disappeared by Shabiha. Now you could be like just like killed by someone and be like, oops, we don't know who did that. And and it really kind of like, so now, because there are many groups who are affiliated with the government, but could be called not affiliated with the government. And because of the chaos and mess, you could be collateral damage, and you could be kidnapped. And so there's no clarity even about, I think, we as activists, like what kind of risk we're navigating, and I think this is like something, we have been very well equipped, and we learned very well how to navigate the Assad regime systems of oppression and surveillance. And this new situation in Syria, and when you're on the ground, and it's really harder to navigate, right? And it's like you don't know how to move. We're no longer walking alone in the streets. We always want to walk in groups. We are careful about what taxi we take, we don't take, the spaces we're at. And I think this is like really not a good indication. Subconsciously, I think we're already doing this right now. I'm speaking here, and I'm like, well, let's see if we enter Syria next time, and if we disappear in Syria next time. And this is a reality. And I think like we're all afraid of naming it, because it's just the grief around it and the frustration, but it's also something that we are all in the background talking about it with, like, amongst certain groups, about like how are we navigating that, and how are we keeping safe while we're also kind of speaking up. And I think that realization is like it's in itself a big indicator of, yeah, we're not imagining. And I think I'm here talking to my other Syrians who like really don't want to hear this narrative, and do not want to hear it, and they're not allowing space for this experience and these lived experiences to be spoken about, because they want to imagine that we are doing something very different and we're trying and all of it. But our experiences are valid, and this is a reality that many Syrians are living. And maybe the second point is about, one of the major frustrations I experienced when I was in Syria last month was the centralization of Damascus versus the rest of Syria. Like when I was in my hometown in Mustafa and all the villages around it, it's another life. It's a completely different planet, and the people there have a different spirit. And you arrive to Damascus, and like it's the centralization of Damascus is actually disgusting, and it makes you feel so frustrated. And the lived experiences, and it reminds you of the days when like Mukhayyam Yarmouk was under siege, and in Bab Shari people are like having their parties. And now the same, like the coast and the المنطقة الوسطى, like the middle area, and it's so sad. You go into all the villages around Masyaf, and you drive in the car, people are in fear, people don't leave their homes. After 6 p.m. everyone is inside, and these are mostly Alawite villages, and people are living in such different reality than Damascus. And even Aleppo and even Idlib, like not just to say minorities areas, like even there, as I mentioned, like even other Sunni areas are experiencing such negligence, right? And this is one of the most classic, like textbook authoritarian technologies and ways. And we see that in Egypt a lot, right? Like Sisi did the same with Cairo, and like just the masking, the change of urban design, the centralization of Cairo, the demolishing of any other random housing and like localized housing, and the fact that in Syria even that we don't have now because it's all destroyed. And so I know I went off the point, but yeah, all of that, I think I'm acknowledging that, and I'm saying that right now because I do feel we're kind of entering a pivotal point, and actually like we don't know what's going to happen next, and who's going to stay alive and who's not. I'm like, for the record, Syrian activists, like we are in fear. I am in fear in my life, and my sister's life, and other friends' lives, and I think this is a very sad reality that we're experiencing.
Yasser or Sara, did you want to take up that question? I also have another. Sana mentioned housing, and I wanted to ask at some point, I don't know if it fits right now, you can address this as well if you'd like, but there's also the question of the reconstruction process and the fact that, the new government has gone along with the very capitalist neoliberal model of which the Assad regime had been taking up. And so there's also the failure to address the disastrous economic conditions, which will likely worsen all the other aspects of these dynamics. So if one of you also wants to touch on that as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to say a few words. I think what Sana said is very important. But you know, as you said, there is the question of reconstruction, and this is in a way a low-intensity war, the continuation of war by other means, the question of reconstruction, because it requires between 200 to 400 billion dollars, and this funding will not come to Syria without a complete political and economic surrender of the state. And we've seen that very quickly. I mean, the Shara government announced very quickly that they're capitalist, they're neoliberal. It was a solemn announcement, and that they are going to implement a liberal economy. But since they don't have the funding and they don't have really any way to reconstruct or create any semblance of economy, they have to rely almost entirely on the question of security. There is a limited amount of loot that they have been distributing among themselves. For example, al-Shara has put his hand on around 600 villas and houses that he's been distributing to different militia leaders and members of HTS. And this is how, unfortunately, the state, or the so-called state, is functioning. They have put their hand on what the Syrian regime left behind, what it couldn't take away with them in terms of companies, the cell phone companies and other companies, and villas and houses and what have you, and have been distributing it among themselves. So the only thing that they have is the question of security. And as Sana mentioned, it's very uneven in the Syrian territory. If you live in Aleppo or in Homs or in the coastal areas, it's very different from your experience in Damascus. And even within Damascus, the different region in Damascus have different experiences. And Idlib is yet another experience where there is very limited space for political maneuvering and political organizing and what have you. What I would also mention is, and that's really saddening because many people who have been working with and have worked with in the past 14 years in terms of organizers and activists and so on, they're split right now. Half of them have become uncritical supporters of the al-Shara government, and in some ways they have become thugs, insulting anyone who's critical of any aspect of the Syrian government. And the other part of the organizer have been trying hard to organize, but at the same time, if they are organizing in Syria on the ground, they've been attacked and they've been insulted, and there are videos of that online. So it's a very difficult situation. At the same time, I think that the current state is weak, and it's possible to resist it. It's not yet the kind of state that the Syrian regime built in the past 50 years. It's not yet the Assadist state. And so I think there is potential for resistance and for pushback and for organizing against it.
I just have to mention something that has, like, when I was listening to Yasser speak, I mean, I come from a very Trotskyist tradition, no longer, but I do come from that background, and, you know, autocritica, like criticizing our own movements and our own, like, we are in a moment though where we are unable as progressives and leftists and Democrats to mobilize the population behind those banners. Of course, those banners are suffering from quite the crisis, aren't they? I mean, specifically after Gaza and even before it. But also, we do have to ask ourselves the question of how can we speak under those banners at a time when internationally and regionally they're suffering, arguably, from their most severe and serious crisis since the Second World War. how can we today in Syria, I mean, yes, I mean, even with the question of transitional justice, and again, I do think that Syrians, all of us, me personally, have suffered from Syrian centrism for the past 15 years. I mean, maybe for legitimate reasons, but it's not the first time that communities are entirely shattered and come out of dictatorships. We've seen this example all over Latin America and in many places over the world. And up till today, for example, in Brazil, I remember very much this argument of we don't want just the commissions of truth. We want commissions of truth and justice. And this discussion goes on 50 years after certain dictatorships have spent, and that's okay. But my question is, one thing is to organize and to exert pressure on transitional authorities to move towards a specific direction when it comes to accountability. But are we really expecting the transitional authorities to have a significant role to play in? I mean, are we agreed that it wasn't revolutionary forces that eventually defeated Assad and took over power? If we agree on that, we do have to characterize, how do we characterize the current transitional authorities? And based on that characterization, what are our tactics and strategies as a movement in Syria? How can we organize democratic, progressive politics under the banner of social justice in Syria today? Do we have the language to do that? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I do think that we are also suffering from a crisis of our own as activists and as progressives and as Democrats. And I don't have ready answers, but I do think that this is also a question worth to ask, because I sometimes feel that we come as progressives from a very high horse and sort of speak to a general population that seems to be lost and doesn't know what it's doing, and we have to sort of lead them to the right path in a way. But really, we are also suffering from our own kind of crisis, I think.
Absolutely.
Can I agree briefly with Sarah? I think that this is really a very important point. And I think that right now there is a counter-revolutionary wave, and that the authoritarian government regimes in the Arab world and beyond are winning, and the progressive classes, forces are weakened, they are marginal. And this is why I think it's important to think at the regional level. There is no response, whether at the economic or political level in Syria, but there is one, I think, at the regional level. When you think about what's going on in Egypt and Tunisia and Sudan and Iran and Turkey, then one can see, the formation of different type of network and forces that could potentially formulate a different type of economic and political response to what we have right now.
Yeah, that's so important. I think we have globally a crisis within the left. We need to get our act together, and and I think that would, I mean, your comments still give me some glimmer of hope or optimism that these kinds of discussions can start, including with the Syrian diaspora, and figuring out what does the Syrian diaspora want to put forward, and how do they want to coalesce there. Sana, you're shaking your head.
Please, American diaspora, have you seen the work? I mean, it's also, I mean, that's a whole other thing. I mean, it's I don't want to mention names, but like there are few new coalitions of Syrian American diaspora who's like bringing Trump agenda into Syria and like promoting that. And so yes, diaspora, but not so much.
Right. The importance of the left being able to do that. And also understanding regionally, like Syria cannot be separated from the counter-revolutionary moment where Sisi and, Jordan are complicit in the genocide of Palestinians, etc. But I wanted to ask, I'm sorry, this is the last question. I've written down 4 questions from the audience that we'll get to after this. But the last question I just wanted to say, because immediately after Assad's fall in December, there seemed to be so much space to express political opinions and debate, and protest. And now 8 months later, this space seems to be closing, and it's increasingly difficult to make critiques of the new government on the ground. So, but are there some ways that some of the gains won with the fall of the Assad regime can be maintained or are still being fought for? I guess, is there glimmers of hope where you see actually this is still a sort of a step forward in that regard?
I mean, if I may just like give something, and even though it's anecdotal, sorry, I do think that it's interesting. I think those our transitional government think it can do politics through communication campaigns, even if it's failing to do so. But I do think that it's interesting to note that every time any topic has sort of made a very big deal or a big fuss, even when it comes to the question of sort of the torture, we're speaking about in the period of 1 month, 5 individuals, and outside the context of Suweida and sectarian like civil war almost. 5 individuals, Syrian 6 individuals, were tortured in the very sense they were liberated from 8 months ago. Okay. This is not okay by any standards, even to the social base of this transitional government. And every time that something hits, a few days ago, last week, there was a play by Malas brothers, who are very quite famous. I've seen twins who do theater, which was cancelled, or it was banned from coming out to public, and there was a huge fuss made about it. And then instantly our joke of a minister of culture came out and said, no, that was a bureaucratic mistake. Of course, it wasn't a bureaucratic mistake. We know very well it wasn't a bureaucratic mistake. We know very well that all of these mistakes that are, like sort of the bad apple argument is not a bad apple argument. But I do think that it is important that there is a reaction. They probably do it because their legitimacy comes from the West. And this is what they're hoping for. Their heads got very much inflated after sanctions are promised to be lifted and what have you. And this is who they speak to. But I do think that this is something we should continue working on. And there's still space for that inside Syria. Not because of the transitional government, but despite them. And again, this is something that we talked about in our very first webinar, even though, and this is tricky because the current government has not yet been able to consolidate military or monopoly of violence inside the country. This is dangerous, but this is also a chance and a space for us to still have relevance. And I have to say also, the threat is not just from the current government. The Syrian society on the ground is extremely polarized. And yes, for example, that demonstration in solidarity with Suweida, or that sit-in, actually, it was just a peaceful sit-in and a very melancholic one, actually. It was attacked by forces that might be allied with the government, but not only. Syrian society, there's a lot of pain. And this victimhood that we are speaking to, how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to deal with an entire population that has been massacred for the past 13 years? And now that it feels that the only justice is one of vigilantes, because there is no true transitional justice process and no accountability. This is not a problem that's going to disappear. How are we going to deal with it?
Very powerful. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I will add a few more things. I agree with you, Sarah. At the same time, I think we should not minimize the achievements and the outcome of the fall of the Syrian regime. One thing I will mention is Syria is probably the only state in the world where people achieved abolition in the real sense. The prisons were emptied completely after the fall of the Syrian regime. Now there are few people, but I think this is very important. I mean, we keep talking about abolition as an abstract or utopian, futuristic project. In Syria, it was achieved, and this is important. When I was in Syria, I attended several discussion in coffee shops, and quite powerful. I mean, it was really transformative. I've never seen anything like this. Maybe in 2000 there were something similar with Ibn al-Am when there was the spring of Damascus. But people were discussing prisons. They were discussing the disappeared. Discussion was supposed to last 1 hour. It lasted 4 hours. And there were, a lot of different and important ideas. The problem is it's still an elitist discussion. And it was a circle of maybe 400 people that often attend those talks. And the question is how to generalize this situation, how to see the re-emergence of revolutionary councils and revolutionary committees all around Syria. I think that's one of the important challenges. It's the Syrian people have created a lot of important, I think, institutions and structures in the past 14 years. The question is, how do we rediscover what we learned during the Syrian revolution? The kind of autonomous politics that emerged in a number of places, whether that's agriculture or food production or construction, or providing bread or water, the management of the city, security, and what have you. The Syrian people were able to manage their own cities and villages and neighborhoods. And a lot of parts in Syria where the Syrian regime disappeared, weakened, was marginal. And people acquired those skills. And I think those are still with us. How do we rediscover and revitalize that culture, that revolutionary culture that is still with Syrian, but also beyond? I mean, the entire Arab world has produced that kind of very important, radical, revolutionary culture that think outside the state, below or above the state, not within the logic of the state and repression and the violence of the state and what have you. That I think has a lot of potential and could reemerge at some point.
So we have a few questions. I'll just pose them all right now. So one of them is, how should we support Syrians? What facts should we be amplifying here in the US? Another one is, what about the role and the goals of big powers, i.e. the US, Israel, Turkey, Russia? I would say that we covered that one more in our first webinar. And then there's the questions an individual in the chat has been bringing up about the Kurdish region. Is it a solution or an alternative? And I know James wanted to say something.
I just want to address that real quick, because I know that we have not had enough space in this series of conversations for perspectives from or on the Kurdish movement and Northwest Syria. I want to acknowledge that. It's something we're committed to doing in the course of this conversation. And if folks have suggestions of folks that we could invite on and into this conversation, I'm more than happy to field them. With this particular group of folks here in this conversation, maybe if I could take the liberty of asking the question a certain kind of way, to bring since we're talking about sectarianism, we're talking about these kinds of political divides, and in particular the regionalism of the issue. I mean, I do think that there are perhaps some interesting lessons to be drawn out of the transnational Kurdish struggle for liberation in Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and so forth, that speak to this moment as well, and especially when we talk about transitional justice. I mean, you mentioned earlier, Sara, about the organizations protesting for transitional justice being, in some senses, the sort of perfect victims. I mean, this is something also that Kurdish families of the disappeared have known in Turkey for decades and decades. There may be, I think, something in that struggle that speaks to this one being even a bit more closer to home than some of the other more global ones. Perhaps there's a perspective on that.
Do any of you want to either put forward some final thoughts, tackle one of those questions, or disagree with something? Maybe Sana, because you have to leave, take a final minute.
Yeah, I mean, I think, unfortunately I have to leave. But maybe just one last thing to say. I think if anything that brings me any light or hope in my life is the people. Like my trust is in the people of Syria, honestly, and my trust in many of those around me who will continue to speak up. And I think I think there is a lot of sadness and grief. I'm thinking about myself internally, and but at the same time, I think we will never stop. I think there is like that with that comes the fight, and obviously it's really sad that we endlessly have to fight. but I think as long as there are many people around us who will continue to speak up, I have hope. I'm not sure we will witness the Syria we ever wanted, but we'll continue to work towards it. So that will be my last word, and thank you all for having me.
Thank you so much, Sana, for being with us, and we're gonna continue our solidarity with you and all Syrians throughout this conversation. Thank you. Yasser or Sara, I unfortunately, like so often has happened in these conversations, it's been so rich we haven't gotten to enough audience discussion. But if either of you want to take up one of those questions or offer a final thought before we sign up here, please go ahead.
Yeah, I will say a word about the double bind that the Syrian people are facing in terms of funding and rebuilding the economy and the question of reconstruction and this package that could potentially come to Syria with $200 billion to $400 billion. I think the sooner the Syrian people understand that the state is by definition predatory and that we should not expect anything from it. The idea of the welfare or nurturing state is not something that will materialize. I think the sooner we understand that, the better. And therefore, the need to organize around this by recreating, as I mentioned, autonomous kind of politics that push back against the logic of the state and the state violence and the state low intensity war against the Syrian. And so recreating spaces where there is a form of autonomy. For example, I'm very happy that the Kurds have some form of autonomy in terms of self-defense, and likewise with the Kurds. I think this idea of centralization of violence in the hand of an entity like Jabhat al-Nusra or what have you is not a good idea. I know that we have been bombarded by the West, that this is the model to follow, that state violence should be centralized, that we should have a unified army and this and that. I think this is a recipe for disaster. We should not follow the European model at all. The more decentralization there is, I think the better. The more people take their security and safety in their own hand by creating their own self-defense groups in their neighborhood and what have you, the better. But that also includes creating our own education, our own food, knowledge production, and what have you. And this seems utopian, but I think Syrians have done it throughout in many different ways. And not only, I mean, if we look at the Sudanese revolution, same thing. With the Egyptian revolution, same thing. The question is, how do we export some of the knowledge that was produced in Syria, import some of the knowledge that was produced elsewhere, and try to come up with creative way to think about state violence and the ways to resist that state violence, and break up that sectarian politics that we spoke about.
Thanks, Yasser. Sara, you have a last word?
Yes, and it's very quick. I'm not going to be able to answer all the questions. I'm sorry about that, but I do just want to end on a point. I work in a journal, in a media organization, and I would say I completely support that you actually do something that is more specifically on the Kurdish experience in the Northeast, but also be careful to invite people, specifically Kurds, critical of the experience, and specifically those that have been subjected also to torture and imprisonment. And I can mention a lot of my journalistic colleagues also from that experience. So yes, again, back to my point, let's by all means learn from experiences of autonomous self-governance, but also be critical of the powers that are at the head of them, not the social movement and the very legitimate causes for self-determination that underlie them. And I do want to go back to Yasser's point as well, and I think this is something that we can observe in Syria today, is that exactly the experience of sort of centralized power in Syria does not work. And unfortunately, this transitional government has lost many a chance to be able to address genuinely and not under the use of force and arms this question. We had a farcical National Congress that could have easily, even if just performatively, genuinely invited many sectors of Syrian society to participate in this very important foundational moment, even to give them more legitimacy, by the way. I mean, even to give the actual transitional process more legitimacy, and they have lost the chance to do that, and they've proven to lose this chance again. Every single chance that they are given, they have not taken up for it. And it doesn't work. It just doesn't work in Syria. Centralized power exclusionary politics is not going to work in this country. And this is something that they better realize for much sooner than later, because we are speaking about a country that is, I mean, we're not just speaking about the risk of sort of sliding back into authoritarianism, but also a very brutal civil war. We are at risk of a very, very brutal civil war. And I really do hope I am wrong. And I don't want to end on a pessimistic. We were speaking about pesoptimism before everybody joined. I don't know how, but I do appreciate having people like Sana, like Yasser, and like millions of other colleagues, hundreds of other colleagues all over the world, in diaspora, inside Syria, university students who have also, I mean, the first few days in Damascus were brilliant. We saw university students organizing protests. We saw lawyers bringing down the bureaucracies and the apparatchiks of their trade unions. And I do think that even if they are not gaining a lot of visibility, because again, it's a very polarized situation in Syria today, those initiatives are still undergoing. And we need time. And this is it.
Thank you so much, Sara. Yasser and also Sana Mustafa for joining us. She had to leave briefly. This has been, again, a very, very rich conversation. I am so grateful to have you all as part of it. For everyone who's here, thank you for being here. If you want to catch up on any part of this conversation or watch our earlier conversations, please head over to MERIP's YouTube page. I posted links for that in the chat. Or if you're in our podcast feed, the audio from the past events is there. The audio for this one will be up sometime next week, I'm hoping. It depends on how fast I can edit things. I also, just want to stress on behalf of MERIP and SPECTRE, we are small, mighty, independent, nonprofit publications, and really depend on the support of our readers, our subscribers, the folks who donate to us to keep putting these things on. And we're really, really committed to continue doing this stuff, for free for everybody. So if you have it in you to support us one way or another, please consider taking the time to do so. Thanks also, lastly, to Shireen Akram-Boshar for co-hosting for this with me, Ashley Smith, who's been working so hard in the background, and the folks from SPECTRE. This has really been another fantastic conversation, and stay tuned for an announcement about another installment of this in the not too distant future. Thank you, everybody. So long.
Thank you, everyone. Ciao, bye-bye.